All right, good morning, folks. I'm sorry I'm not there with you today. I'm at my county curriculum writing thing again today. So today you guys are going to be learning about the French Revolution. So we're continuing on with our unit on revolutions. The French Revolution is similar in many ways to the American Revolution. Okay, so we're going to build on the information that we talked about yesterday in class. So you should have already answered your bell work question, which is, in our nation, is everyone equal? We'll talk about your bell work a little bit tomorrow because we're going to finish up the French Revolution tomorrow. So the essential questions that we're going to be able to answer from your information on the French Revolution are: what were the long and short-term causes of the revolution, and how does the French Revolution constitute a revolution based on the definition that we talked about? So a major or drastic change over a relatively short period of time. Okay, notes today are pretty short. We're going to do more tomorrow, but I need to give you a basis so that you can do the activity I've got planned for you today. So, long-term causes of the revolution. So here are the philosophical causes. We've already talked about humanism. So humanism came out of the Renaissance, and that was that idea that all individual people have value. And then during the Enlightenment, we talked about how people applied the new learning of the scientific revolution to things like human behavior, and therefore to government. So people believed that leaders should be enlightened despots or educated leaders, and they should care about what's best for their people and not just do what they want to do. So this idea that everybody has value and this idea that leaders should be educated and do what's best for the people are going to lead people to have new ideas about government and new ideas about what their leaders should be doing. Economically, France had some issues going on during this time period. So they had some pretty major class inequality, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in a minute. So their social classes were called estates, and there were three estates. There were the clergy, or the religious leaders, the nobility, who were those people who had a lot of money, people who inherited their titles, people like barons and dukes, and these people who had these massive tracts of land that they passed down from generation to generation. The first and second estate had all the power, even though they were a tiny, tiny proportion of the population, okay? And then the third estate was everybody else, so workers, farmers, the majority of the population. So we're going to talk about them more in a minute. In addition to the class inequality, there was gross overspending by the monarch. So the king and queen during this time were spending tons of money on luxuries and not helping the people at all. And then there was a famine going on. So year after year of really bad harvest, leading to a food shortage, which made things even harder for the peasants. So this is a graphic that I like that shows the three estates. So the first estate was about 1% of the people, and they owned about 10% of the land, which is really disproportionate. Even worse were the nobles. So the nobles were about 2% of the people, and they owned about 25% of the land. So the first and second estate together are only 3% of the French population, but they own more than a third of the land in France. And land, as we already talked about with the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and that whole era, land equals wealth. So these people have about 11 times more wealth than they should by proportion, which leads the rest of the population, the workers, the farmers, the artisans, the traders, to struggle and be really poor and not get the things that they need. And they start to really resent those other two social classes. This is a political cartoon from the time period. So the French at the bottom translates to, you hope this game will end soon. And you have the clergy, so that's this guy in the purple, and a noble, this guy in the red, riding on the back of a worker. So he's doing all the work, he's doing all the hard stuff, and they're just sitting there enjoying the ride. Without the third estate, you wouldn't have any work being done. You wouldn't have food being grown. You wouldn't have roads being built. And yet the other two estates didn't respect the third estate at all. This is Marie Antoinette. She is quite possibly the most famous French monarch. Interestingly, she's not actually French. She's from Austria. And she married the French prince in the 1760s, I think. To begin with, she was really, really popular because she was considered to be very beautiful. She was pretty nice to the people. She would go out and meet them, shake their hands, whatever. But being princess and then later queen kind of went to her head. So she is most famous for spending huge, ridiculous amounts of money on things like clothes, makeup, wigs. The king gave her a couple of country houses, and she thought of herself as kind of an interior designer. And she would spend ridiculous amounts of money on silks and gold and jewels and all these things to decorate these country houses that were basically just a hobby for her. If you go to the Palace of Versailles in France, there's all this gold and jewels and mirrors and glass, and it's just absolutely crazy. And that was designed during this time period. So during this period of extravagance in the French court. A lot of people tend to portray Marie Antoinette as being this empty-headed, very vain aristocrat. And while she was pretty vain and was fond of spending money outlandishly, she was also pretty smart. And she was really interested in science and technology and exploration and colonization and all that stuff that was going on during this time period, which is why she's depicted in this image with a globe. And there's also a book in the lower corner. So, a short term event that led to the French Revolution was the American Revolution. So, the American Revolution, as we talked about yesterday, happened in the 1770s. And the French Revolution is going to start about 10 years later in the late 1780s. France is going to see that it's possible for a nation to separate or rebel against an unfair monarch. So rather than breaking off and forming a new nation, though, France is going to decide to do something different with the monarch that they currently have. So, what happened? The first phase of the French Revolution was called the People's Revolt. So, the Third Estate, that lower class group of all the workers and the peasants, they first try to do the right thing, the nonviolent thing, by bringing their concerns to the Estates General, which was kind of the French version of our Congress. It was a lawmaking group that advised the king. So even though the king had all the power, this group, the Estates General, kind of handled some day-to-day government decisions, and they could also sort of advise the king about what different groups of people wanted. So at first, the Estates General didn't listen to the Third Estate and didn't really care what they had to say because they were, the poor people. So some members of the First and Second Estates, though, believed in Enlightenment ideas. So they actually were really receptive to what the Third Estate had to say. So slowly, the Third Estate starts to get people to listen to what they want. This is a quote by a guy named Abbé Sieyès. He's a Catholic clergyman, so a priest, and he is a supporter of the Third Estate, even though he is a member of the First Estate. Okay? And this is one of the most famous quotes about the French Revolution. So he says, "What is the Third Estate? Everything. What has it been until now in the political order? Nothing. What does it want to be? Something." So what he's saying is, without the Third Estate, we wouldn't have anything. We wouldn't have our roads. We wouldn't have our food. And yet they have gotten no say and no political recognition until now, and all they want is some respect. So the king starts to get wind of this, and just like we've talked about with other revolutions, autocratic, powerful monarchs don't like people taking away their power. So the king is going to prevent the members of the Third Estate from meeting to try to prevent them from plotting against him. So the legislative building, their meeting house, he closes it and doesn't let anybody in. So the members go instead to a nearby gymnasium because it's the biggest facility that's nearby that can hold all of them. And they swear the tennis court oath, which is a funny name, but it's one of the most important events of the revolution. They promise not to leave that location until they've written a new constitution for France that gives more rights to the Third Estate. So if the Third Estate was just doing this by themselves, they wouldn't have the numbers to be able to pass this constitution. But almost all of the representatives of the First Estate join them, and also about 45 people from the Second Estate representatives. So they're able to get enough support to pass this new constitution. So as people get more and more ramped up and more interested in this idea of a revolution, the king starts trying to tighten his hold. He starts trying to tamp down any whispers of rebellion among the people. In response to this, the Third Estate storms the Bastille. So the Bastille is a prison in France, and it's also where they kept a lot of their munitions, so a lot of their weapons, because obviously you should keep weapons in a prison. Anyway. So the people were concerned that the king would use the French soldiers to try to put down any rebellion. So they said, we have to arm ourselves. So they storm the Bastille, they free all the prisoners, which sounds really dramatic, but there were only like 10 prisoners. Um, and they steal all these weapons. They set the Bastille on fire. And reportedly, there's legend that the king, upon hearing of this, said to one of his advisors, "My goodness, this is a revolt." And his advisor said, "No, sire, it is a revolution." Super dramatic. Anyway, so the common people seize power. They write this document called the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which is kind of like our Declaration of Independence. And so they're basically saying we have rights in and of ourselves separate from what the king says. And they create a constitutional monarchy. So I've talked about constitutional monarchies before when we talked about the Magna Carta in England. A constitutional monarchy is where you have a king, but he is subject to the same laws that everybody else has to follow. So he can still be king, he can still make decisions, but his decisions are limited by what the national constitution says. One thing that's worth noting about the French Revolution is that women played a key part in the revolution. That's because, especially in the lower classes, they had as much of a role in growing food, in producing goods, in society as the men did. And so, although they were not necessarily the ones, stealing weapons, they were the ones marching in the streets and, refusing to buy from people who supported the king. And so they had a lot more power in the revolution than women typically do. And they had a really big role. One event that's talked about a lot is this thing called the Fishwives Revolt, where you had these third estate women who showed up outside the palace and said, Marie Antoinette is throwing all these feasts and all these banquets, and we're out here starving and we can't feed our children. She should give us some bread from her coffers. And this is when Marie Antoinette supposedly said, ha ha ha, they want bread, let them eat cake. Which basically means, I don't care that they're starving, they can go away. Because obviously if you can't afford to make bread, then you can't afford to make cake. So Marie Antoinette never actually said that, but she did have a lot of disdain for the lower classes. And so one reason that the monarchs were really unpopular is because of how the women saw Marie Antoinette. So just recognize that women played a really key role in this revolution. Okay. So for today, this is where we're going to stop. We're going to take the rest of the notes about what happened in the revolution and what happened after tomorrow. But what you're going to do today is you're going to watch a film called Les Miserables. This is based on a book by Victor Hugo. So Victor Hugo lived several years after the French Revolution, but his book is a work of historical fiction, and it talks about these people who are living during the French Revolution, and most of them are members of the Third Estate. And he talks about some of the struggles that they go through being part of this poor lower class in the lead up to the revolution. And at the end, some of them decide to participate in the revolutions in both violent and non-violent ways. So as you watch the film, you need to actively be watching, so you should not be sleeping, you should not have your electronics out, and you should be taking notes. You're going to have a viewing guide, but it's for you to complete after the film is over. So while you're watching, you probably should take notes as you go so that you remember what you see. In the packet that your substitute is going to give you, there is a list of characters so that you know who is who and you know what their names are. There's also a timeline in there of the events of the French Revolution and the events in the life of Victor Hugo, who is the author of the book that inspired this film. Okay, so you're going to watch the film, you're going to take notes, we're going to finish it tomorrow because I doubt you're going to be able to finish it today, and then we'll finish our notes on the French Revolution tomorrow also. If you guys have any problems or have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email on Edmodo. Anyone who's not here today or who is not going to be here tomorrow, you'll need to come during Sparta lunch to watch the parts of the film that you miss. Okay, so for the rest of today, I love you, make good choices, make me proud. All right, thanks guys, have a great day.